And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you aboard a very special teaching that we have today about Hanukkah. My name is Michael Samuel Smith, and I will be your host today. The title of our program is called They're Here. I think many of you know that the war that started in Israel on the 7th of October 2023, there were many people that were caught off guard that were on the Israeli side of the border from Gaza. As you know, many were murdered that day, probably about 1,200 people on the Jewish side. But today I wanted to do this program, and I titled it, They're Here, because those people that were on the Israeli side when they were being attacked on the 7th of October 2023, about all the time they had to warn their friends or neighbors or family members somewhere outside of their residence. All they had was just a few moments to get on their cell phone and maybe just text a few words. There were a number of them that said, quote, "They're here." So I have named this program, They're Here. So I want to welcome you to a perpetual story about the Feast of Hanukkah. Now, to start, I want to give a little foundational information here. I think it's in order about this subject, since most Christians are not familiar with the most of the Feast of Israel, let alone Hanukkah. Many Christians might ask, well, why should I be educated about this feast since they're associated with Jews or Israel? To get the real story here, we need to go back to Leviticus chapter 23. There we will find 7 feasts that God had initiated. Feasts like Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, and at the end, in the fall, we have trumpets, atonement, and of course tabernacles. Concerning all of these feasts, the Lord said in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 2, "These are my feasts." So they're not feasts that are only dedicated to Jews. They're dedicated to all believers, even though there are ceremonial mandates that Israel are required to participate in. Well, why is that? Because all of these feasts are pointing to types and shadows of the coming Christ, who came 2,000 years ago, and God created in Israel with the mission of propagating the truths of God and His Word throughout the whole world. Then God had initiated a new covenant with the Gentiles to extend that mandate of salvation. So the Romans had built the roads, and the Greeks had provided the language that would take the gospel to the whole world. Now, there are 2 feasts that Israel celebrates that are not directly in the Bible, Hanukkah and the Feast of Purim. Hanukkah takes place on the 24th of Kislev on the Hebrew calendar. It goes for 8 days and usually starts around the 2nd or 3rd week of December, around your Christmas time. And Purim takes place on the 14th day of Adar, around early March on your particular calendar. But we're focusing on Hanukkah today. You won't find it in the Old Testament. In fact, the only place you'll actually find it is in the New Testament in John chapter 10, verses 22 and 23. In your King James Bible, it's referred to as the Feast of the Dedication. The word dedication came actually from the Hebrew word Hanukkah. So when did this Hanukkah event actually take place? Well, to help explain this, you might remember the book of Malachi. It's actually the last book in the Old Testament. And the New Testament begins with the book of Matthew, as you know. So there are actually 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. This 400 years is referred to as the intertestamental period. So in the middle of these silent years, the Hanukkah story had come about. Now, you may recall in the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great and his Grecian army marched across the Near East and conquered many lands, including Israel. After he died, these territories came under control of the Seleucids, which were one of Alexander's 4 generals. Then the Seleucid dynasty ruled Israel for approximately 2 centuries. Around the 2nd century BC, Antiochus III became the Greco-Assyrian leader. He forced Israel into paying a tribute tax, but actually did not intervene in their religious practices. But then this Antiochus III was replaced by Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and that is when the terrible time of persecution had begun in Israel. Now, the Greeks wanted to totally eradicate Judaism. This Antiochus IV, when he came in, he attacked Israel with 22,000 men, and he attacked them actually on a Sabbath, sort of like Israel being attacked on Yom Kippur in the 1973 war, and attacked Israel on the 7th of October in 2023 during the Feast of Tabernacles. Notice it's when Israel isn't fully prepared because they're involved in a time of celebration. After Antiochus took Jerusalem, he killed many Jews, men, women, and children. He then placed a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies after killing the high priest and the regular priest associated with the temple. He also sacrificed a pig on the altar in the Holy of Holies. So Antiochus Epiphanes IV proclaimed himself an earthly representation of the false god Zeus. We actually know what day that took place on the Jewish calendar, and it was the 24th of Kislev in 167 BC. Now, as you know, in BC, we count backwards. This is the day the daily sacrifice had come to an end on the 24th of Kislev. That is the first day of Hanukkah, and that is the first day that Hanukkah is celebrated on the Jewish calendar today, every year. I would like you to make note of that day, which falls around the 2nd or 3rd week of December every year on your calendar, which, again, is around your Christmas time. Now, Hanukkah is not Christmas, but it is a time of gift-giving and celebration of victory over the evil persecutors every year. Now, this time of terrible persecution lasted for 3 years in Israel. In fact, anyone found practicing anything Jewish, such as Passover or circumcision, those practices were actually punishable by death. In other words, the Jewish faith and all aspects of that were to be totally erased. Only paganism was allowed to be practiced, and once a year, Jews were required to worship the false god Zeus, the pagan god. And if they refused, it was instant death. Over time, a number of Jews were going along with this, quote, cancel culture. But then in 167 BC, a revolt began in a town called Modin. It's located about 27 miles northwest of Jerusalem. A priest by the name of Mattathias refused to worship Zeus, and once the enemy soldiers had showed up there in that town, he wouldn't go along with any of this. Another Jew that was standing by volunteered to actually kill Mattathias, mainly because he was fearful that the soldiers were going to kill everybody in the town. But Mattathias beat him to the punch, if you will, and actually stabbed this fellow Jew that was going to try to kill him. He was stabbed to death. Now the Jews around Modin, they had rose up to defy the Greco-Assyrian army, and they were really fired up because of the action that Mattathias had taken. Now, Mattathias had 5 sons. One son, who was called Judas Maccabeus, would now lead the Maccabean revolt against the oppressors in Israel. Now, Judas conducted guerrilla warfare and over time made great success against the enemy. This went on for 3 years. Judas finally took back the city of Jerusalem and ultimately captured the temple back. As it turned out, the corrupted temple had to be sanctified and rededicated. That actually took place when? On the 24th of Kislev in 164 BC. Exactly 3 years to the day that Antiochus took over Israel. So Judas Maccabean means Judas the hammer. Now, once the temple was cleansed, the menorah had to be lit, but there was a problem. No holy oil could actually be found at that time. And then it was discovered a small vial of holy oil had been found, but it was only enough to sustain lighting the menorah, the 7-branch candlestick in the temple, for 1 day. So they had to make a decision. Do we light it or do we not light it? But actually something very miraculous had taken place. It actually stayed lit for 8 days, which was an impossibility. They also knew during those days it would take some time to create a new vial of holy oil. But when the 8th day came around, they now had a new batch of oil, and the flame was able to keep on. As strange as it sounds, the 24th of Kislev is a very historic date. There were 4 major historical events that took place in Israel's history on that day. Number 1, the Second Temple foundation was laid on that day in the year 520 BC. Number 2, Antiochus IV suspended the temple sacrifices that day in the year 167 BC. Number 3, the temple was recaptured and purified on that day in the year 164 BC, 3 years later. And number 4, Jerusalem was delivered from the Ottoman Turkish Empire that day in the year 1917, exactly 400 years after the Ottoman Turkish Empire took over Israel in the year 1517. Can you see the hand of God in all of this? Well, I want to let you know that I can. Okay, so let's look at how Hanukkah is actually celebrated today. Since it's the Festival of Lights, the servant or middle candle is lit. That middle candle is called the Komish candle. And then each day, one of the 8 candles is lit. So it's technically a 9-branch menorah that people have in their homes today. Now, since this is about the 3rd week of December, the candle brings in light during the darkest time of the year, which of course December is the darkest time of the year. Jewish children, they all take part in these different feasts of Israel, which includes Hanukkah and Purim. But during Hanukkah, children will play a game with a 4-sided top called a dreidel. Each side actually has a letter, and each child may win or lose spinning that dreidel, and as it falls, showing on a particular letter. Many times they use for fun, they use a gold coin looking candy with chocolate in it, and that is called gelt. So they have these coins called gelt, and as they spin the dreidel, depending on which letter it falls on, some of these children win or lose that game. Now, a great miracle happened here. I did want you to know that a letter on the dreidel actually has a meaning, that a great miracle happened here if you're in Israel, or it means a great miracle happened there if you're not in Israel. Again, this game is played all over the world by Jews every year. It's the children who often light the separate candles each night of Hanukkah. Now, food also plays a very important part of Hanukkah. Quite often, donuts are eaten. Why? Because they're made with oil, which is the prime ingredient in donuts. And it's the fuel also of the menorah lights, as you know. They also eat latkes, which are potato cakes, also made with oil. Now, as we read and reflect on John chapter 9 and 10 in the New Testament, I wanted folks to know that Jesus says, I am the light of the world in John chapter 9, verse 5. Now, chapter 9 deals with a blind man who was blind since his birth, and he is a man that Jesus is actually going to heal. Now, in John chapter 10, Jesus claims to be the Good Shepherd. This takes place the same day Jesus healed the blind man. But in John chapter 10, verse 22 and 23, and I'm in the King James Bible, clearly shows Jesus the Messiah inside the temple. Again, this is 2,000 years ago, on the Feast of the Dedication, and it says that in the Bible. So it is referring to Hanukkah. My personal opinion is this actually took place on the first day of Hanukkah. When? The 24th of Kislev. Remember, when Jesus heals the blind man in John chapter 9, it's the only time he heals a blind man while inserting wet clay into his eyes. Now, I know it's a wild idea of mine, and I've been sharing prophecy now for 48 years, but is it conceivably possible the temple is actually located where the Garden of Eden was once located, and it's here where the Lord Jesus Christ created Adam from the clay, and the Holy Spirit breathed life into Adam? I'm sure we'll find out when the kingdom is here if that's true. Now, I've shared this thought, and I'm on the record over 4 decades saying, I truly believe Jesus was born on the 29th of September, 5 BC, the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. But let's just make believe for a moment that that is true. That would place Jesus being conceived 9 months earlier. Where would that happen? That would be in the month of December, wouldn't it? What would you say if I told you Jesus was conceived on the first day of Hanukkah, the 24th of Kislev? That would place the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary on that very day. Maybe the Holy Spirit is giving us some clues about significant things that have happened on some of these dates. Now, as we know, John the Baptist is 6 months older than Jesus because the Bible tells us that. So if Jesus was born on Tabernacles in September 5 BC, that would place John the Baptist being born around the month of March, possibly during Passover. Now, you don't have to agree with my hypothesis, but it does get one to think. Now, let's talk about Hanukkah today. As we're on the home stretch now, I want you to know, I think it's fair to say this last Hanukkah, December 2023, has a great parallel between what happened in Israel 2,200 years ago and what's taking place in Israel right now and what's taking place in America right at this snapshot of time. Just as Hellenization was deconstructing Judaism 2,200 years ago, Israel was being pulled away from their religious values, and anti-Semitism was on steroids. The whole world seems to have a very strong, hateful attitude toward the Jewish people today in the state of Israel. We have students across America demonstrating against Israel's right to even defend themselves. This is, now, I do want you to know right now, this is December 2023, and well over 11,500 missiles have been fired into Israel. They're fighting a front on actually 7 different fronts. And the United Nations and most of the world's countries are calling on Israel to call for a ceasefire. That includes our own administration in Washington, D.C., I might add. By the way, if Israel agrees to a ceasefire, it means they lost the war and the enemy will be allowed to regroup and start war all over again. Now, last but not least, as far as looking forward about Hanukkah, a few hundred years before Antiochus and the Greco-Assyrian army overthrew Israel, there was actually a prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, about a future abomination of desolation. A type and shadow of that actually took place years later when Antiochus Epiphanes IV, with him. He was a type and shadow Antichrist in 167 to 164 BC. 3 years that lasted exactly. Remember, he is the one who put a stop to the daily sacrifice and polluted the holy sanctuary, and in a type and shadow way declared himself as Zeus in the flesh, or God with a little g, if you will, in the flesh. Then in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, and Mark chapter 13, verse 14, Jesus himself, 2,000 years ago, forewarned Israel of another abomination of desolation that will happen again in Israel in the future. Tribulation, that is. Like Antiochus, the future Antichrist will declare himself as God in a future third temple, and again, the future daily sacrifices will be halted, and we do know about that in the Bible. As you know, there isn't a third temple in existence right now, but this predicts a future one, in fact, will be built. And I believe that will happen in this generation. So, let's get right into this. Why should Christians have an interest in Hanukkah? Now, we all know, we as Christians in the West, we have our own calendar and we have our own holiday customs, and most are okay with that. But it's important to know that Jesus was Jewish as well as the apostles. They operated on God's calendar. That connected to all the 7 feasts of Israel found in Leviticus chapter 23. It's often been said Hanukkah is all about 2 things. It's all about fighting and it's all about lighting. And during the time of Antiochus, I wanted you to know all the Jews were living under tyranny and all their religious liberties were being stripped away. Hanukkah is not a time just for Jewish people. It's a time for all people to support freedom. There are many lessons that we all can learn and take away from the Maccabean revolt 2,200 years ago. Just think, if that revolt was not successful, a religion that believed in one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, could have died out. Keep in mind, when the Maccabean revolt took place, Christianity didn't come about until another around 200 years later. Because our Christian roots are grafted into Israel, as alluded to in Romans chapter 11, it's extremely important that all Christians love and support the nation Israel, as well as all of the Jews, wherever they may be found in the world. Our marching orders are found in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Those that love and support Israel will be blessed, and those that hate Israel and the Jews will be cursed. That can apply to individuals as well as to nations and their relationship with Israel. One way a nation can come under a curse is God allows evil leaders to to take over countries. Now, we've seen that several times in the Bible stories, but we also saw it with Mao Zedong in China, Adolf Hitler in Germany, and Saddam Hussein in Iraq years ago. Case in point with the Nazis in November 1938, Kristallnacht was the beginning of the great discrimination against the Jews and their businesses in Germany. Why did that take place on the 9th of 1938? Now, why did Hitler choose that particular date? Well, I can tell you why. He chose it because it was the birthday of Martin Luther. And Hitler wanted to get the Christian denominations to support his cause. And he had a lot of success doing that, unfortunately, for the world. Now, on the home stretch, the reason I'm discussing Hanukkah and its parallels to Israel is because right now, in America, a great Hellenization is taking place throughout our entire society. And you could say World War III has been placed against the youth of our land as they're deconstructing our national history and promoting wokeism as a religious pastime. This is all taking place to lure us all away from God and what is right. So, what can we do about it? Aside from asking God's favor and protection, we all need to take a stand and stand up for what is right. If all the Christians stood up against Hitler, there never would have been a Holocaust. It also means getting involved in standing up against schools and universities that support hatred against Jews. It also means we need to vote out activist people who endorse evil and vote in people who have a biblical worldview, who support law and order and Judeo-Christian values. Well, folks, I hope you learned some new and important concepts from this lesson. Now, during Hanukkah, all over the world, Jews have a very famous expression, and that is, Om Yisrael Chai, which means the people of Israel live. Now, many of Israel's enemies in the past are now in the dustbin of history. God's people are still with us, and we are blessed to be a part of that. Now, I wanted to say something here. I want to end this with something very upbeat, and that is, I wanted you to know that there is a story in 1 Samuel chapter 30. It's a story about David. David is still on the run, if you will, from King Saul. Him and his soldiers are there, and they came back from battle one day. And I wanted everybody to know that this takes place in a place called Ziklag. So David returns with his men. This is where all their families were, their wives and their children. They all lived in this town, if you will. And when they returned, guess what happened? All the women and children had been taken hostage by the bad guys, by the Amalekites, okay? And so they're missing in action. Of course, they're mourning over this. And, this was a terrible time. Just think about it. If your whole family is missing in action when you return, well, that actually happened there. And the men got so mad towards David, they even threatened to stone him to death. Now, thank God that did not happen. But David was smart enough to go before the Lord and pray, and he asked for God's favor and asked for his wisdom about what to do. And the Lord had told him in chapter 30 that he would have victory over the bad guys, the Amalekites. And not only that, they would get all of their hostages back. Okay? I wanted you to know that. Okay, so what takes place now, David gets 600 men together, soldiers together, and they go off to war against the Amalekites. And about 200 of them are left behind at this place called Bezor, this brook which means cold in Hebrew, by the way. In other words, a cold brook, because they feel so faint. So 200 were left behind. 400 go on. By the way, 400 being a number of anticipation, I might add. And so David finds the Amalekites. He has total victory over that. And guess what? He got all the hostages back. Okay? Now, Brother Mike, what is all this about? I told you I wanted to share an uplifting story. You're not going to believe this. Now, that happened 3,000 years ago, right? Okay. Ziklag is exactly where the Jews were taken hostage and their homes were burned on the 7th of October, 2023. It's on the Gaza-Israel border today. It's the same place. Now, what can we take away from this story? Well, this is what we can take away from this story. David had total victory over the Amalekites. And I wanted to say something about that too, because when you go into Exodus chapter 17, verse 16, and I'm paraphrasing this, God says he will be at war with the Amalekites from generation to generation. That includes now. So the Amalekites they're not dead and gone. We saw it with Adolf Hitler. We saw it with Saddam Hussein. We see it with Hamas now. So that's the way it will be until the Lord returns, and there will be total victory. So, but I did want to share that story with you. And here's another little golden nugget about that story. Now that's in chapter 30 of 1 Samuel. The next chapter, chapter 31, King Saul and his 3 sons are killed at Mount Gilboa. And then 2 chapters later, now we're now in the 2 Samuel chapter 1 and 2, and 2 Samuel chapter 2, which is a later time, right, after all this happened. Guess what? King David is the king of Israel. Now, I know that God has victory over the situation in this war in Israel. It's still going on today. So I wanted you to be blessed with that. There are many lessons that we can learn here in these stories. So remember the Maccabean revolt, the word Maccabean or Maccabeus means the hammer. So are you going to be a hammer for the Lord, or are you going to be a milquetoast? Well, it's up to you. Well, I hope you've been blessed with everything I shared. May the Lord richly bless you, and shalom, shalom.